Hey there! If you love exploring Christian philosophy and theology, you're in the right place. The video's about to get started, but first, I want to ask you a question. Do you find the content I produce on this channel valuable? If so, here are some ways you can help promote it. The first is completely free. Give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Second, consider doing a one-time donation, kind of like a tip. You can do this in the form of a super chat or super thanks below. Third, consider becoming a patron. Patrons get early access to videos, they get to be a part of a patron-only Facebook group we call TAC Academy, and patrons can participate in the book club that meets on Zoom once a month. The link to become a patron is in the description. Thanks to all my current patrons for your support. Enjoy the interview. What can you do to make sure you live a meaningful life, and can philosophy help in this endeavor? That's what we'll be discussing in this interview. Welcome, I'm Jordan, and this is The Analytic Christian, the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Paul Blaschko. I hope I'm saying your last name correctly.
Absolutely, that's how you say it.
He is a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and he is the co-author of an excellent book called The Good Life Method. And that's what we're going to be discussing, some of the major points of the book. I found a lot of it really insightful. Let me just ask you first, Dr. Blaschko, what made you write this book?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me on. I'm a big fan. I really appreciate this. So my co-author, Megan Sullivan, and I have been teaching a course here at Notre Dame for, it feels like a decade. I think it's like 6 or 7 years. And it's called God and the Good Life. And the idea that we started with was, a lot of times introduction to philosophy is taught as introduction to the discipline of philosophy or introduction to the philosophy major. But most of the students that we have here at Notre Dame don't go on to major in philosophy. They don't go on to get a doctorate or, become part of the profession. For most of them, they're taking this as a required course because Notre Dame is a Catholic university, says, look, philosophy is so important to your formation that you've got to take this class. And so we stepped back and we started rethinking. We said, look, if this is our one shot, or maybe this is one of a couple of shots that we've got to communicate the big ideas in philosophy to our students, do we really want to sort of mask it behind all these professional norms? And I love the discipline of philosophy. I love the rigorous argumentation and the conference sort of debate style. But a lot of our students, that's kind of foreign to them, and it really puts barriers between them and encountering what I think are really deeply practical, important ideas. So we started teaching this course, God and the Good Life, as a philosophy as a way of life course, where each day we would invite our students to think about a really big idea, something that's important from the history of philosophy. We'd introduce them to a philosopher, so maybe Plato, Aristotle, Marcus Aurelius, Anscombe, could be anybody. And then we just put some big topic out there for their consideration. One of the days we say, look, friendship is essential in life. Nobody would choose to live without friends. So what does that mean? Let's pick that apart, right? Or another day, we say, in order to come to the best conclusions, you should really trust tradition. Don't try to think of everything for yourself. Don't figure it out for yourself. You're going to make all kinds of errors out there. And then, of course, the next day we'll come back and we'll say, well, no, Rene Descartes says you've actually got to exercise this intellectual autonomy. So the course, is an accessible way of coming at some of these different topics. And again, some of them are sort of, we're putting philosophers in conversation with each other even. So it's not dogmatic. We're not saying here's the 24 truths of philosophy for you. We're saying here's 24 really important ideas to consider. And here's some help sort of walking along that philosophical journey. So that's how it started out. And, the course has become very popular. We teach about 1,000 students at Notre Dame every year. So at some point, Penguin Press reached out and they said, you ever thought about writing a book about this stuff? And step back and we thought that's a great idea. I mean, we're already kind of reaching this broader audience. So we took on that project a couple of years ago. But that's sort of the genesis of it. That's kind of the big picture.
Awesome. So is that basically the goal of the book then, or would you characterize the goal of the book differently?
Yeah, let me say a couple of things about the goal. And we talk all over the place about goals in this book, about setting goals and reflecting on your goals and how you should think about these goals. I'd say the big picture goal, and this is, sort of like take this loosely. I'd say the big picture goal is Aristotelian, right? We want to introduce a broad audience to this idea, this virtue ethical idea, that we have a purpose, that we have a function as creatures, as human beings, and that philosophy plays a really vital and essential role in allowing us to fulfill that purpose or fulfill that function. So I'd say, really broadly construed, this is an idea that goes all the way back to Plato, Socrates, Aristotle. And if you look at these philosophers, they actually articulate it in language that is really accessible today. So, Aristotle gives us this argument. He says, look, whenever you're aiming at something, you're aiming at it because you think it's good. Now, either you're going to do that for everything that you're aiming at, it's aiming at some other good infinitely, which is absurd, or there's some end to the things that you're aiming at. He says, if you don't know what that is, then you're going to be like an archer who can't see the target. You're never going to hit it. There's no chance you're going to hit it. So what is that? What is that aim, or what is that end? Well, Aristotle argues it's happiness, right? And like, what more modern idea could you have than that, right? We're all essentially aiming at happiness. But Aristotle's got, a really complex way of sketching that out. He says, happiness is not just this feeling that you get. It's this way of embodying the virtues. It's this contemplative relationship with reality. So I'd say the goal of the book is to start with this really intuitive idea. You want to be happy, philosophy can help you. And then over the course of the book, unravel or unpack this much more, I think, nuanced, complex idea that in order to do that, you're going to have to acquire virtues, and you're going to have to, live at a certain, there's going to be a certain shape to your life, your overall life. So again, I want readers not to be intimidated by that, but I do want them to encounter that idea sort of in its complexity. And so I think that's the kind of goal that I had going in. It's this translational project. It's like, how do you make eudaimonia, right? This Greek sort of state of contemplative flourishing. How do you make that sort of as accessible as you can, so that people can look at that and think, wait, maybe that's what I'm aiming at. Like, maybe I'm already committed to this, and maybe philosophy can help me. So I'd say in a really big picture way that was my goal going in writing the book.
Yeah. Well, you already mentioned this word eudaimonia, so
Yeah.
I wanted you to take some time to spell out exactly what that is, because it's not just happiness.
No, that's right.
It's a much bigger idea than that.
Absolutely. And here's how I introduce it to my students, if you'll kind of like play along with this sort of thought experiment, right? So once they hear that Aristotle claims that we all want to be happy and aim at happiness, a lot of us, automatically assume, well, okay, I know what happiness is, right? Like, if I'm feeling really good, like as soon as I get a raise, or like somebody texts me and says like, you're great, I get this feeling. But for Aristotle, it's really important that we don't mistake that feeling, which is a part of eudaimonia, it's a part of a well-lived life, for happiness itself, right? Because if we're just aiming at this feeling, we're going to be really misled over the course of our lives. And so here's the silly thought experiment that we give our students to help them think about this. We say, okay, everybody here wants to be happy. I have them raise their hands and say, yeah, we all want to be happy. Okay. So suppose I had a button, and if you push this button, you will instantly feel this sort of bliss that you get whenever it is that whatever the thing is that gives you that. For me, it's like, sipping the first sort of taste of Starbucks on like a hot summer day. It's an iced coffee, just boom, you'll feel that for the rest of your life. You'll never stop feeling that. Who would push the button, right? And none of my students raise their hand. And I say, well, why not? They start saying, well, look, if you push the button, what if something really tragic happens and then you're not able to respond to it in the right sort of way? You say, okay, good point. You say, well, what about, all of those times when you're trying to accomplish something, and the only reason you keep going is because you're uncomfortable with the state that you're in now, right? Maybe it's something deeply personal. You want to achieve some goal, become a better person, get better habits, or just, finish writing a book. There are ways in which our students start sort of, intuitively appreciating pain, suffering, can be a part of a well-lived life, a happy life. So once we get there, we say, okay, So happiness, eudaimonia, this ultimate state that Aristotle's saying that we're aiming at, it's not this feeling. It's not this kind of surface level thing. So what is it? Well, here's where it gets more complicated. And here's where I have to do a bit more to motivate my students. I say, okay, stay with me for a second. So Aristotle says that eudaimonia is contemplative activity in accord with all of the virtues, right? And we got to break that down a bit. And we got to say, well, what's a virtue? Yeah, okay, it's the thing you would think of, generosity, kindness, love. But it's also, there are intellectual virtues, this curiosity, this sort of, getting onto an idea and just not wanting to let it go. Or love of the truth. In the book we write about this very distinctive virtue, wanting to know when other people don't want to know, or when it would be easier for you not to know. Okay, so Aristotle's got a way of defining these, but we say, okay, let's say we can identify what these virtues are. Aristotle thinks that eudaimonia is what happens when you acquire all those virtues, and it's really important that you acquire all of them because they all work together, right? He says, look, if you acquire some of the virtues but not all of them, it's actually going to be worse for you. Imagine the really smart, fraud. They're going to be able to get in a lot more trouble overall than if they had sort of this generosity, this kindness, this honesty. So they all work together. You get those, and then Aristotle says, and here's where it gets mysterious even for me, and I'm like as big of a fan of Aristotle as I possibly could be. And then he says, and then you engage in this sort of ultimate activity, which is this reflective, contemplative activity. Now he thinks this is a philosophical activity. And maybe that's right. It's kind of fishy that the philosopher is what's the ultimate activity? Doing philosophy. But I can see something to that. But eudaimonia, just sort of to step back for a second, it characterizes a life in which somebody has accomplished that kind of a state. They're in a position where they can sort of contemplatively encounter the truth, reflect on reality, and they've got all these virtues, right? The easier way to identify it might just be to think about exemplars. I think we all probably have people we know or we think of as wise, as just, as prudent, as just when they have an issue or when an issue comes up, you think, man, they would know exactly what to do in this case, right? Or if they encounter somebody who's suffering, they know exactly sort of how to speak to them, what to say. So another way of coming at it is just saying, okay, forget for a second the theoretical stuff and sketching out the account of virtue. You can look at exemplars and say, yeah, it's eudaimonia is the kind of thing that they embody, that they are, right?
Yeah, that's helpful. Okay, now in the book, you go through. I guess in a way, there's two halves of the book, and the first half focuses on, I guess, the good life in a way, and the second half is how God fits into the good life. I hope I'm characterizing that. As I read it, that seemed about right.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how I want to structure the interview. The first half here is going to be on certain virtues, and the second half's on how God comes into the picture. So you talk about the role of loving truth in our pursuit of the good life. So can you elaborate on why it's important to love the truth if we're to live this good life?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me kind of, to set the scene, let me just tell a little story that I tell in my class, So let's go all the way back to ancient Greece. We've got Socrates walking around Athens, and he's just being obnoxious, right? He is going in the public square. He's finding the most powerful public figures that he can, and he's just not letting them go. He's asking them these questions. He's saying, look, you're the governor of this city, right? Your job is to make sure that the city is harmonious, that justice sort of permeates the city. So what is justice, right? And of course, everybody that he does this to, they kind of just they do what I'd be like, I don't know, man. It's just, giving each his due, right? They kind of give this knee-jerk reaction, and he doesn't let it go, right? He just keeps asking these questions. Okay, so this gets Socrates in so much trouble that eventually they hold a trial and they say, look, you are undermining Greek democracy. Like, you are embarrassing these public figures. People are starting to doubt whether we've actually got a grip on, the nature of the gods and the nature of justice and the nature of virtue. You've got to be stopped. And they kind of, come up with these fake charges, and they put them on trial. And Socrates says, look, you want to know why I'm doing this? Well, let me tell you a story. So here's the story within the story. Sorry, it's getting meta. He says, look, I went and talked to the Oracle at Delphi, right? And I didn't even want to go. My friend was going. And I was like, okay, I'll go with you. The Oracle says to me, you, Socrates, are the wisest in all of Athens. Now, again, imagine he's saying this like in a court of law. Like, he isn't doing himself any favors here. He says, how could this possibly be true? He said, I know that I don't know anything. He says, if there's anything that I know, it's that I'm cognitively limited. I'm constantly like reaching for these truths. I want to know these things, but every time I come up with a theory, I come up short. So he says, how could this possibly be true? And so he sets out to prove the Oracle wrong, right? Again, all these great sort of philosophical characteristics, right? First, he's like saying this in the court of law. Then you're thinking like, so he's proving the Oracle wrong, like this divine channel. Like, these are not like the right sort of impulses. You can see why he's getting himself in a lot of trouble. And so he goes around and he says, this is why I'm asking these questions, right? And he says he's doing it out of a genuine desire to know the truth. Now, I think this is an incredibly inspiring story. As a philosopher, I mean, like, spoiler alert, he dies in the end. They say, look, you can either be free and stop asking these questions, or you can die. And he says, look, the unreflective life is not worth living. If you don't allow me to go around and ask these questions, to go through that process, to constantly examine all of my beliefs with the people in my community, I would rather die. I'd rather be put to death, right? There's something kind of heroic about this. There's something totally nuts about it too. Like, as I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, stepping back and I'm thinking like, oh man, like how am I getting so sucked into this? But I think what Socrates represents to me is almost this heroic commitment that parallels the kind of commitment that martyrs have to the faith, right? They're offered this choice. It's like, okay, you can either denounce your faith and continue to live, or you can die. And they say, life's not worth living if I can't practice my faith, right? And of course, there are secular analogs to this. But to be that committed to the truth and to asking these kinds of questions, to me, it's deeply inspiring. So one of the virtues that we consider in the book is this desire to get at the truth. And I think in my own life, in my own experience, this is one of the things that philosophy has given me that I most value or appreciate. I love being in conversations with people that I could not be more different from, and feeling like we are pushing in the same direction, right? I believe that God exists. I'm a Catholic. I've got a bunch of kids, like I'm a particular kind of person. And I can be in a room with somebody who is an atheist, who thinks like it is immoral to have kids, right? And yet we are engaged in an activity not to tear each other down, to just embarrass each other or exert power over each other, but to really get at the truth. And I think that is something that when it's done well, and it's not always done well in philosophy, but when it's done well, it is one of the most beautiful, inspiring virtues that you can see, right? And to me, it's just one of the greatest joys, right? To sit there and debate with somebody, really go back and forth. Now, obviously, this is not something that has permeated our culture. There's a lot of argumentation that doesn't really aim at the truth. And I should say, I understand that, right? I understand the impulse that one has when they're attacked. Like, if I go on Twitter for like a minute, I'm just like, it's over. I can't even like post on there. Because if somebody comes at you and they're like, well, look, you're an idiot. Here's 10 reasons why you're wrong about the thing that you care most about in the world. Yeah, I'm not going to engage with them and say like, oh, well, tell me more. Explain to me all of the ways in which I'm wrong. There's a way in which that's sort of fundamentally challenging to your identity. And so I totally understand. I understand the sort of dynamics that are at play, such that people, ordinary people, might not appreciate or even see that there's a way of doing this that is not adversarial, that is not going to just tear people down. And again, at its best, when we really reach this point in class, or with, philosophers at a conference, whatever, just in conversation, I just got to say, there's just nothing better than that. And so I think that's a distinctive virtue. And I think that's something that we should care about and cultivate. And maybe indirectly, that sort of virtue, if we got really serious about it in our culture, maybe it could do some good, right? Maybe it could help us untangle some of these horrible sort of polarizing debates that we've been having.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you told that story about Socrates, because someone may be tempted to think, well, you don't really have to pursue the truth to have a good life. You could clearly pursue like false things, isolate yourself from people that you disagree with, and perhaps that would have really good consequences. Like you'd have a lot of money in your bank account, or you can imagine like those sorts of things. But the good life, as we defined it at the beginning, this idea of eudaimonia, it seems like truth is very much needed to
Totally
achieve that kind of life.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotle says, every man desires by nature to know. Plato gives us this great sort of analogy. He gives us this cave metaphor, right? And I think the way to establish this, I mean, in my own experience, and if I'm talking to somebody and trying to argue with them and say like, no, truth is this really essential part. It's hard, right? It's hard to convince them. Like you said, you can imagine many different ways that your life could be organized where, yeah, you're totally isolated from the truth, or you just don't care. You're like, maybe it's true, maybe it's not. But for me, the key is thinking back to a time when you were pursuing knowledge for its own sake. Now, I assume this is not something that just philosophers do. I really think so. I think a lot of people have had this experience. A lot of my students say, they reached a point in high school where they stepped back and they said, look, I am like devoting so much energy and time to my religion, and it's something that my parents just told me to believe. Like, how do I know that this is actually right? And they tried to go through that process, really consider that. Now, when you actually achieve some sort of understanding, it's like impossible to describe. Like that moment of just like, oh, I see. Like, to me, that is so much better than any of these other sort of good things. And they're genuinely good things. Getting money is great. I assume. I'm a philosopher. I don't know. Getting money is wonderful. Being comfortable, sort of taking a vacation, whatever it might be. To me, there's something so much deeper about arriving at this kind of, just sort of intellectual awareness, this contact with reality. And those are the moments for me that I use when I'm trying to envision what Aristotle or Plato or Socrates is talking about. And so at the end of the Nicomachean Ethics, where Aristotle says, okay, you guys, listen, like this kind of contemplative contact with reality, this way of understanding the world, like this is what we're aiming at. And on the one hand, I'm like, okay, I'm going to trust you there, bud. Like, I'll try to acquire all the virtues and we'll see what happens. On the other, I think back to these kinds of experiences and I think like, okay, I can kind of see that, right? And then of course you can give all kinds of arguments that any of these other good things are going to be less than fulfilling ultimately. And I think those are just like deeply compelling arguments. I was talking to a guy the other day, incredibly successful person. He's at retirement age and he says, look, I know so many people who have gone for money. They've gone for, certain kinds of status, wealth, whatever. And I said, well, like, how'd it turn out? And he said, unhappy, like every one of them. Now, it's one guy. This is like, an anecdote. But I think, again, extrapolating, looking in my life and seeing where that stuff resonates. Yeah, like when I've been seeking that sort of stuff, I think we all are familiar with this idea of this kind of treadmill, this kind of hedonic treadmill where you just like, you achieve the thing and you think like, I thought that was the thing. It's never the thing, right? Anyway, so yeah, okay. Kind of ranting now.
No, that was all good. Okay, so that was the role that loving the truth plays in your pursuit of the good life. Now let's shift. I'm going to kind of cluster these in the book. I think you separate these out, but we're going to put them all together. Let's talk about the role that work, money, and charity play in our pursuit of the good life.
So one of the things that we're doing in the book is we're really trying to resist a particular view about how we should be living. That is essentially, it's a utilitarian position. Often it gets written about as effective altruism, right? And Peter Singer, Will McCaskill, these are kind of the heroes of this movement. And throughout the book, we're really trying to push on that sort of utilitarian logic or reasoning, right? And so I'll sketch the basic view. The view is just that, look, as people in an economy like ours, and who are roughly like, as educated as we are, sort of, have options, the best thing that we can do, the sort of morally obligatory thing for us to do, is make as much money as we possibly can and then give it away to incredibly effective charities, right? Now, on the one hand, I don't think anybody's going to be like, oh, that's monstrous. Like, of course, that's amazing, right? To sort of be that kind of self-sacrificial. That's great. On the other hand, from a virtue ethics perspective, we think it really misses a couple of really important features, right? So here's one. Think about the role that work plays in our lives. We're at work in the modern world for most of our waking hours, right? At least between the ages of 20 and 65 or something. Okay, so if you are instrumentalizing your work, you're saying, I'm going to do whatever pays me the most, right? That's a choice that you can make, but it's going to have ramifications. It's going to have some sort of effect or impact on your life, right? Now, again, going all the way back to Aristotle, we can find philosophers who have argued that what you do, what you put yourself into, shapes the kind of person that you are, right? Aristotle, and this is controversial, Aristotle has some arguments against engaging in certain kinds of manual labor, because he says, look, that's going to, it's going to make it so that you can't think as clearly, you can't think things through in the way that's appropriate to your nature as a human being. Now, on the one hand, and this is why it's controversial, we want to think, gosh, look, there's dignity in manual labor, manual work. On the other hand, when it goes too far, I think we all just agree with it, right? If people are forced to work in a factory setting, go to the classic sort of Marxist example of alienation, so that they can barely use their mind. They're just they might as well be a machine in this sort of instance, right? There's a way in which this deforms the body, the soul of the person. It sort of impoverishes them, right? And so, to the extent that that's the case for a particular job or for a particular class of jobs, it seems like the sort of ethical imperative is to make sure that people don't have to work those kinds of jobs, or they don't have to exclusively work those jobs, or they don't have to work them 12, 14 hours a day, whatever. Okay. All right. So Aristotle thinks the kind of work that you do is going to deeply shape your character, the kind of person that you are. And he thinks this is true sort of across the board. He thinks if you're the kind of person who is a craftsman, you are exercising this kind of judgment and embodying certain skills and virtues. This helps you grow as a person, right? To be a master carpenter requires virtues that are going to benefit you in your everyday life, even apart from your work, right? So the kind of work, again, the kind of work that you do is deeply important. And this is one of those things that I think the effective altruist kind of skates over, right? You're never finding any chapters in these books about what it does to your soul to earn as much money as you possibly can. I don't even know, how I would maximize my income. But if it was to become an investment banker, wonderful profession. But for me, I would die. I would just be totally soulless. I would die in that work, right? At least on the inside. So to not even consider the way in which work shapes and forms our character, our soul, and impacts our ability to live good, flourishing lives, I think that's a huge shortcoming. We're sort of losing sight of the human person, and we're instrumentalizing. We're sort of turning ourselves into these kind of instruments of ethics in a way that I think is deeply objectionable. The same thing goes for money, right? Money is a way of amassing and sort of codifying a kind of power. And while it's really noble to think, yeah, you should donate money and find charitable organizations that work well, it doesn't seem totally right to us that you've got an obligation to do this totally apart from any sort of knowledge that you have about the people involved. So one thing an effective altruist would say is, if I give money to a person in my community, and I know they're not going to spend it super well, but look, giving the money to this person is a way of recognizing their dignity and saying, like, look, you deserve this as much as I do. And I know it's not going to just like ruin them or something like that. The effective altruist is going to say, that's a terrible choice. Like, you're not abiding by your ethical obligations. But I think the virtue ethicist wants to say those relationships, like what relationship you have to somebody else in your community, those can really matter. And so the virtue ethicist is not going to say, we can't donate our income, or it's like immoral to donate income to charity, even across the world to strangers. Of course, like these could be great virtues, right? But we are going to want to bring the human person and considerations of that person, the relationship that you have to other people, back into the picture, right? And maybe one last bit that I'll just sort of add to this is, in the book, we really rely heavily on Elizabeth Anscombe, and to a lesser extent, although he's kind of in the background, Bernard Williams, for this idea that the intention with which you give, or the intention with which you work, really changes and transforms the character of the giving, of the work, right? And so it's as important to pay attention to your inner life as it is to pay attention to the consequences that you anticipate for a particular action. There could be actions that look, this is not going to be effective. Nobody's going to see it, but it's the right thing to do. Like, given my convictions, given my principles, I can't help but do this thing. The virtue ethicist is going to have a story about why that's true, about why that sort of inner cultivation of character is important. Whereas the effective altruist is not, right? They're going to say, well, look, if it's got no good consequences, then you're a fool, like, if you care about this. And so those are the ways that we're thinking, and that's kind of the big sort of interlocutor throughout the book. We kind of keep coming back to this, in part because it's just been so dramatically influential in our culture. There's just so many, if you look at philosophical movements that have really like permeated the culture, have had a huge influence, it's going to be the effective altruist. So in a way, it's kind of a sign of respect that we're sort of boxing with the effective altruist throughout the whole book. But that's the way that we tend to think about it, or about those issues in the book.
Okay, you mentioned Elizabeth Anscombe, and so this will segue nicely. This next section was one of my favorite chapters in the book, when you talked about I guess it was a pamphlet or some type of thing she said in response to Eisenhower dropping the bombs.
Yeah, Truman. So they were.
Or I'm sorry, was it Truman? Sorry.
Yeah. So Harry Truman, they were going to give him an honorary degree at Oxford, and she and Iris Murdoch and a couple of the virtue ethicists that were at Oxford at the time, they were looking around. They were thinking, like, why are we giving Truman an honorary degree, right? And of course, it was very controversial. It's still very controversial to this day. But at the very least, she thought, it is not obvious that this guy has done something that is morally praiseworthy, that is worthy of an honorary degree, right? And so when nobody listens to her, she thinks, look, I'm just going to write up a pamphlet. This is my kind of philosophy, right? Like, it's been a long time since I've come across a pamphlet like on the road. It's like written by a philosopher. She writes up this pamphlet, and she says, look, here's the reason why we shouldn't give Truman this honorary degree. She says, and her argument's pretty simple. She goes through the sort of complexities of the empirical facts of the matter, but her argument's pretty simple. She says, look, killing somebody as a means to your end is murder. Killing an innocent person as a means to your end is murder. She says, again, given the facts, and we can bracket that for now, this is what Truman is doing. He was dropping the bomb to kill a bunch of civilians as a means to ending the war. Was that a good end? Of course it was a good end. Everybody wanted to end the war. That's, war is always horrible. But she says, look, we've got to hang on to this basic moral truth that killing an innocent person as a means to your end is murder. So by that logic, Harry Truman is a mass murderer, right? Nobody listens to her. They totally ignore her. So she's like, all right, I'm going to write a book about it. Writes one of the most important books on action theory, probably the most important book on action theory of all time, Intention. And really tries to sketch out the view and really tries to motivate this, again, against the consequentialists of the time, the sort of effective altruists of the 1960s. And it's a beautiful book, and it really shaped our thinking, especially about the ways in which these descriptions of action, of what we're doing and why we're doing it, can make a difference when we're evaluating somebody as having done something good or bad, as sort of a virtuous person or as a vicious person. So Anscombe, for me, she's like, I don't know. I always say, like, she's my favorite philosopher. It's a terrible party fact, but yeah, it's my favorite philosopher of all time, and sort of is hanging in the background for a lot of the book, a lot of the different chapters. Really comes out in that chapter on responsibility, though, that you're referencing.
Yeah. So one of the big takeaways, and I'll get you to elaborate on this.
Yeah.
One of the big takeaways from that chapter was storytelling. Storytelling plays a really important role in our pursuit of the good life. So can you sketch that out specifically, like not just so when we tell this story, we're incorporating the intentions of the person doing these actions.
Yeah.
So those intentions play a really important role.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So take like a really silly example. I show up late to a meeting, and I say, sorry that there was so much traffic, right? That's like a very thin narrative. There was a lot of traffic and I am late, right? It leaves a lot of things out. In fact, it leaves all the crucial things out, right? Was I late because there was a lot of traffic? Was there an abnormal amount of traffic, right? Could I have predicted that there would be that level of traffic, et cetera? So we use these stories all the time when we're trying to excuse ourselves from responsibility or when we're trying to take responsibility, right? One of the most important things to do with children, I've got several kids, and my 6-year-old, he's my oldest. One of the sort of most important moral milestones, developmental milestones that I've seen in his life, his inner life, is using storytelling to take responsibility for something that he's done. I ask him, like, why did you do that? He says, well, I was frustrated, and so I threw this book at my sister. And to be able to do that, right? Just to say, like, here's what happened. And it's not just a series of events that like is out there. It's like, no, I made this choice. I did this thing. It reveals our intentions, like you were saying a second ago. It's incredibly important. This incredibly important capacity that we've got to taking responsibility, to living a good life. One of the sort of ways that we can break this down a little bit too is we can consider this very famous case that Anscombe gives in her book, Intention. And the case, I mean, now it seems sort of quaint, or it doesn't make a ton of sense to us, but she's talking about somebody who's pumping at a well, right? So like an old well where you're pumping. And she says, look, when you're pumping at a well, there are an almost infinite number of descriptions that are true of the physical event that is happening. You might be, like tapping out the rhythm to Happy Birthday. You're contracting certain muscles with Latin names in your hands and arms. You can, but none of those, I mean, we don't have a reason to think any of those are especially morally relevant. Because if I asked you, like, why are you, moving your dorsiflex? I don't know any muscle names. You wouldn't even have known that you were doing it. You'd say, like, oh, like, am I? I don't know. So for Anscombe, what's really important is it's those descriptions for which you have an answer to the why question that you're morally responsible for, right? So if I say, why are you doing that? And you say, oh, well, I'm trying to get some water to, give to my family so that they stay hydrated. Okay. Then your action is intentional under that description. Well, those descriptions are the building blocks of the kinds of narratives that we tell about our lives, right? So one of the connections that we make in the book is between this kind of capacity that we've got to use these stories, this descriptive power, to take responsibility, and the idea of a philosophical apology, right? Or telling the story of your life, like Augustine did in the Confessions, or like Socrates did, right, in the Apology, telling the story of your life in order to make intelligible some commitment that you have and some action that you performed on the basis of that commitment. So for Augustine, it was his conversion to Christianity, saying, like, I know all of his friends are like, why would you do that? Like, they have the worst poetry. Like, this is terrible. You were like a professor of rhetoric, right? How could you convert to this barbarian religion? He says, well, let me tell you the story. Let me explain it to you. And along the way, he's giving arguments, right? Same thing for Socrates. They say, why are you walking around undermining Greek democracy? You say, I'm not. I can't help but pursue the truth. This is how I pursue the truth. And so throughout the book, this is what we're encouraging our readers to do as well. And this is what we encourage our students to do in the class. We try to put philosophy in the context of the life that they're living so that they can start to narrate. And in my own life, as I've put some of these exercises to sort of use in my own life, they can have surprising effects. You try to tell the story of your life from now until retirement, or now until you die. And you think like, gosh, like there's no way of telling this story where I am like balancing all my commitments at work and at home. There's just no way. Like I'm not doing that. Like the reason that I'm working like on this project or doing this kind of a stuff, it's really just for my own sort of gain. Like, what am I, right? So it can be kind of revelatory as well. But for us, the idea is, you want to be able to tell these kind of, as Bernard Williams would say, morally thick narratives. These narratives that really paint a picture about the kind of intentionality that you're exerting and why you're doing what you're doing. Because again, for us, that's kind of an essential capacity. It's an essential virtue that you've got to have.
All right. So that wraps up kind of the first half of the book. We've talked about why loving truth plays an important role in your pursuit of the good life, work, money, charity, and storytelling. Like you just said, all of these play important roles in your pursuit of the good life. Now, let's bring God into the picture. What role does God play in this pursuit of the good life?
Yeah, so this is kind of a great sort of moment in the class, and I feel like in the book, where we pivot and we start asking these questions about faith, right? These really existential questions. And one of the ways that we get into these questions is in both the class and the book, we think about William James, and in particular his essay, The Will to Believe, and the way in which faith already permeates so many different aspects of our lives, right? So you might be skeptical of theism or of sort of religious faith. But one of the things that William James suggests is like, you can't be skeptical all the way through. Like you're taking things on faith all the time, right? And it's perfectly normal to do so. So one of the stories that we tell in the book to kind of get into the religion section is we tell this story of a woman, Amanda Eller, who finds herself lost in this forest reserve in Hawaii through this series of terrible events, right? And she's trying to survive. She's trying to make it. She's fallen off this small hill, broken her kneecaps. Like things are not going well for her. And she says from her hospital bed, she says, look, I was thinking about like whether or not I was going to make it. And I had no choice but to believe that I was going to make it because it was life or death. And this really strikes a chord with me because I watch tons of documentaries about survival. I don't climb mountains. I just like watch all the horrible things that people who do climb mountains. And there's this is a recurring theme, right? If you want to survive in these extreme situations, you've got to believe that you can do it. Or a few years back, I was watching this Alex Honnold documentary, right? Where he's I think it's called Free Solo. And there's this horrible scene where he's leaping from this rock face on Yosemite. He's leaping from his position to another position. He's got no ropes on. And you think, look, if he was thinking analytically on that mountain, like, am I going to make this? And he like weighed up his options. And he's like, well, the evidence suggests that like, I'm a pretty skilled climber. I'm like, 70% yes, maybe not. Okay. He's never going to make it, right? And this is William James's point. He says, if you find yourself in a situation like this, the sort of courageous thing to do, the most rational thing to do is to say, okay, I'm going to commit. I'm going to take a leap of faith here. Because if you don't do that, it's all over. You're going to die. Now, of course, William James says there are particular conditions that have got to be met. He doesn't want to just like rationalize any kind of leap of faith. But his argument is that these kinds of leaps of faith, these small leaps of faith, are all over the place in the social world, in the physical world. We're doing this all the time, right? We can't really escape faith. And so that's our starting point too in the book. We actually also consider Pascal's wager in this portion of the book. Now, Pascal and James had a really controversial sort of like, they did not like each other that much. But, I find the logic of Pascal's wager to be pretty Jamesian, sort of when you get down to it. I think that there are a lot of similarities here. And so that's the first step, so for the person who's coming along who maybe is picking up this book, not because they've heard about the class or not because they're, particularly religious, I want to say okay, that's the first step. Probably you've got a lot of faith in your attempt to live the good life, even without religion in the picture. And then we take a second step and we say, well, what about like a Christian faith, or what about a particular religion? And here again, we consider some really moving stories. So we consider the story of Stephen Colbert, whose father and several of his brothers died in a tragic plane crash when he was really young. And yet he's maintained his religious faith. He says, in fact, his faith got stronger because of this event. And we ask, how does that possibly make sense? As part of the story, we consider both Aquinas's proofs for God's existence, but also the problem of evil. And we try to sort of weigh these things with one another. And the sort of conclusion of these sections, at least from my point of view, is that if you're attempting to live a good life, you're kind of naturally going to be marched towards these more existential questions. Aristotle himself says at the very end of the Nicomachean Ethics, he says, look, this kind of contemplative reflection is the thing in us that is most like the activity of the gods. And it's mysterious and it's almost beyond our grasp. And we probably can't practice it fully in this lifetime. You think how did Aristotle, totally outside of any sort of Christian theistic, religious, philosophical tradition, he walks right up to that line. Of course, Aquinas just then leaps over the edge of it. And he's like, yeah, of course, that's why you need theology. Although don't tell my colleagues in the theology department that I said that, because theology's fine. But right, so for me, there's a really natural way in which these kinds of questions, if you're pursuing this kind of path, right, this kind of good life, the method, I guess, the good life method, they're going to be raised. They're sort of inescapable. And then it's a question about which direction you go. Now, Megan and I, in writing the book, we're very clear. We're coming from a Catholic perspective, and we try to make that accessible and explain to some extent why that is. We also don't, in the book, we don't offer anything like a decisive argument for God's existence. We're not telling readers hey, coming away from this, you're going to believe or be totally irrational. But yeah, that's sort of the starting point, at least for us, when it comes to faith.
Yeah. One thing before we wrap up here, one thing that I'll mention about the way the book is written is it feels much more conversational, because every chapter incorporates stories of real people and kind of their journeys through different areas of life, like we've been talking about. And so it's not like maybe a typical philosophy paper that I'll read and do an interview on, where it's here's the argument, 1, 2, 3, and here's the support for this premise. It doesn't read like that at all. It's much more narrative. And I think that it was a good change up for me, and I'm sure that my viewers will appreciate that too.
Sure.
Okay. This chapter, I said earlier, one of my favorite chapters was the one about Elizabeth Anscombe. But this chapter that I'm about to mention was my favorite in the book, partly because I just hadn't really thought about it the way you all talked about it before. And that was reflection on death. Yeah. It actually, you would think but I want to live a good life. Why would I think about dying?
Totally.
So it seems counterintuitive at first, but it was really fascinating. So how does our reflection on death help in our pursuit of the good life?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that I think philosophers can say about death that help both in the moment to think about what matters most to us, right? So even at the very beginning of this, we started talking about, thinking about whether you would live a particular life minus some essential good, whether that's friendship or whether that's pursuit of the truth or whatever essential good you're identifying. so thinking about death and thinking about the end of life and thinking about, if I got to the end of my life and I realized I'd never done this thing, or I didn't have a good relationship with my kids or whatever it might be, it can help us sort of look to the future and look to the rest of our lives and make changes, sort of in the moment. But one of the things that philosophy has done historically is it's also helped us deal with fear of death, right? I think a lot of people are afraid of death. I mean, yeah, if Freud's right, this is like, fear of mortality is like behind like a lot of our sort of dysfunction. And so in the book, we consider a couple of different angles. One of them is, arguments against the fear of death, right? Socrates has this argument that I think is fun. He says, look, either death is like sleeping forever, or it's like going to a party where you can talk to anybody who's died before you. He's like, parties are amazing, and who does not love sleep? And you're like, yeah, you got me. Like, right? Or Lucretius gives us this argument that says, look, you're afraid of your death. You're afraid of not existing sort of after the end of your life. But think about all the time that's come before you existed in the first place, right? You're not afraid of that. Like, that's kind of weird. Same metaphysical state, so don't be afraid of it. One of the thinkers in this vein that we spend a lot of time with, and that I really loved reading more about and getting more of an introduction to, is Marcus Aurelius. So Marcus Aurelius is a Stoic philosopher, and Stoicism is everywhere. Man, Stoicism is so popular these days. So it was really fun to like dig in and kind of learn more about his life. He thinks, look, one of the most important things that we can do in thinking about these big sort of existential anxiety invoking topics like death is to remember that most of the things that we value above all else are things that those externalities can't touch, right? So for Marcus Aurelius, he's got these meditations. He says, if you're ever finding yourself anxious about what's going to happen to you after you die, or what's going to happen to your money, or like whether you're going to make any money, remember that the thing that matters most in life, and again, Stoicism is a kind of virtue ethics, is this cultivation of character, is the truths that you've discovered, is the love that you have for your family. Now, Aurelius doesn't actually go that far with the love of the family. He's actually a lot of the Stoics are kind of brutal when it comes to relationships with family. He's like, yeah, look, if your kid like sort of leaves you, it's just like losing a mug. Don't worry about it. So like we kind of differ there. But again, I do think there is something to this kind of contemplative, meditative process, right? To really recall what it is that you value most. And use that to center yourself. So those are some of the different angles that we came at that topic from. I enjoyed writing that chapter. I'll also admit I felt totally unqualified. I'm like 32 years old. Like I'm like, I asked my family members so many questions as we went through this, especially my dad. It was just like my mom. I was like, guys, does this like ring true? Like you guys are wise. You've achieved more eudaimonia than I have. But I love that. I love that section. Yeah.
Yeah. Probably honestly, the quote that stuck with me, I guess there were two things in that chapter that stuck with me that the viewers might appreciate. One was, I'm paraphrasing here, but it was something like, all the good philosophers practice dying.
Oh yeah.
And I thought, wow, at first you're like, what? Why would anybody practice dying? But they like think about their deaths. And that can reveal things that they might do differently now. Like, the other one, I guess you had a thought experiment somewhere. It was near the beginning of the chapter, I think, where it was like, okay, pretend for a moment that you've lived a long, happy, a long life. Like you're at an old age, you're surrounded by all your loved ones, but you're about to die. Now, just like get in that moment for a second and just like think about that. And I thought about that for a while. I was like, I'm glad I did that. It revealed some things that I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't really care about this thing that I'm doing today. Like that's not that important to me. In those moments.
I think that's so great. I think too, I mean, it explains some of these otherwise somewhat mysterious practices that you find in like medieval monasteries where monks are walking around like reminding each other of the moment of their death. Or, I actually looked this up to see if this is a real thing or not. I couldn't find confirmation that there are monks that like sleep in their coffins. I'm sure there are, but you think about this, right? And you think, man, like how morbid is that? Like, what are these guys like obsessed with death for? But then you think, yeah, there's a way in which that both focuses the mind and also practicing death, right? Makes it less terrible. I think that's now that you say that, that's a quote I got to look up again. I think that's the quote. I think Socrates says, philosophers practice death, and so it is less terrible for them than for any other man. And I think, man, how sort of prescient is that? Like to sort of invent like hundreds, I guess thousands of years before like cognitive behavioral therapy. Like here's a way of making some deep existential topic less anxiety inducing. Just exposure therapy. Just like envision it, think about it, deal with it, and then make sure that you're living your life in a way that you're not going to get to the end of it and totally regret the decisions that you've made. So I totally agree. I think that those sort of practices, those ideas, some of the most powerful things to come out of philosophy with respect to death.
All right. Well, to wrap up, I thought this would be a good way to do it. I turn little sections of my videos into shorts that I can put on TikTok. You know all about TikTok.
I love it.
With I should have mentioned this at the beginning. Dr. Blaschko, to me, has the best TikTok channel out there. I love it. If you have TikTok and you aren't following him on TikTok, you need to. He does lots of hysterical, like you will laugh your head off. Lots of funny things in there. So I won't get into that, but definitely go check it out. So I'm going to try and turn this into a TikTok video. Yeah. So in 60 seconds, if possible, what is the good life method?
Oh, that is such a good question. So the good life method is using philosophy to think really seriously about what your ultimate goals are and how that lines up with your purpose or your function, the kind of creature that you are, right? So as we said in the very beginning of this, we all want to be happy. And in order to be happy, we've got to achieve certain kinds of things. Now, you might think those things are success and money and status. Well, the philosophers are right. If Aristotle's right, if the Stoics are right, if Plato's right, that's the totally wrong list of things, right? And philosophy can reveal that. We can argue to a list of virtues, things like love of the truth, love of wisdom, friendship, deep friendships with other people, that will, in the end, actually help us achieve this thing, that it is our purpose, that it is in our nature to want to achieve, right? This kind of deep happiness, or what Aristotle calls eudaimonia. So I hope that was clear enough. Maybe a little.
No, that was great. That was really, really well done. Well said. All right. Well, I've really enjoyed getting to talk to you, Dr. Blaschko. Thank you so much for doing this.
Yeah, thank you so much. This is really fun.
All right. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next time.